let's get started. I want to welcome all of you this evening, although it's hard to see you out there. My name's Ronnie Lipschutz. I am the provost of College 8, and I'm also professor and chair of politics, and I'm a masochist. I'm also the dark force behind this conference, and before I say a few words about Ecotopia and Ernest Kallenbach and introduce our keynote speaker, I want to explain the origins of the conference. So bear with me for a few minutes, okay? When I went back to graduate school in 1982 in the Energy and Resources group at UC Berkeley, I was told I had to read two books. One was The Monkey Wrench Gang by Edward Abbey. He's had plenty of conferences. The other was Ecotopia. And I think, they both had a great impact, at least on my way of thinking. The Monkey Wrench Gang, of course, is many ways much more exciting and tells you what to go out and do right away. Ecotopia requires that you think some more. But after I arrived at UCSC in 1990, I occasionally taught a class called Thinking Green in the politics department. And I had students read both of those books. So one day I had the idea of asking Chick Kallenbach whether he might want to come and speak to my class. And much to my surprise, he agreed to do so. So he came 2 or 3 times, I don't remember how many. We got to be friends, although I was never, really a close friend of his. And the last time, which I think was about 10 years ago, maybe 12, I suggested a 30-year, a celebration of the 30th anniversary of the publication of Ecotopia. And Chick demurred. For some reason or another, he didn't particularly like the idea. So that one didn't happen. I became provost of College 8 in 2012, and for those of you not familiar with the college system or UCSC, there may be a few of you out here, or what a college provost is, let me assure you that the position carries considerable responsibility and little authority. People are very impressed when they hear I am a provost. I sometimes get headhunted on the basis of that. And at least until I tell them, what a college provost, that I'm not that kind of a provost, that, college provost is nothing like, the provost who runs the universities. Anyway, when I became provost, incoming frosh were required to read Grapes of Wrath during their summer break prior to coming to college. And I thought it would be a great idea to add Ecotopia to their reading list. Certainly, it's not as difficult to get through as Grapes of Wrath. That one takes a lot of work and a lot of chewing. But the students did it, as students do. I mean, I never know exactly if they're reading what they're assigned, but we have faith. This is the 4th year now that this requirement has been in place, and I think I've increased by about 1,500 the number of people in the world who have read Ecotopia. But at the same time, when I became provost, I had this idea of honoring Chick and Ecotopia. He had recently passed away. The 40th anniversary of the publication of the book was coming up, as was the 50th anniversary of UCSC. And I began to, I thought that was actually an interesting sort of confluence. And I began to plan in 2012 and started to save the college's money, sort of, socking it away, to make the conference possible. So after 3 years, here we are. I'm so pleased to see all of you here, and I hope you enjoy and learn a lot today and tomorrow. Before I proceed, I need to acknowledge the many supporters of this conference and the people who made it possible. So I'm going to read all of them. I'm only going to do it once. And so again, please bear with me. So most of the funding comes from the Distinguished Visiting Fellow Fund at College 8. It's not Professor Fellow. And then from the following co-sponsors: the Social Sciences Division, Anthropology, Sociology, Politics, Latin America and Latino Studies, Environmental Studies, Art, History, Literature, Crown College, Merrill College, Cowell College, Stevenson College, Porter College, Oaks College, Kresge College, the Center for Cultural Studies, the Institute of Arts and Sciences, Institute for Humanities Research, the Everett Program, the Chicano Latino Research Center, the Science and Justice Research Center, an anonymous donor, the UC Natural Reserves Program, the Student Environmental Center, and University Relations. So what I did was I made everybody sort of take a little chunk of this. I also want to recognize the tireless efforts of Joe Chamberlain, who is my assistant. The design work for the poster by Yoel Van de Sande and Nelson Sahan, and the dedication of the numerous interns and student ushers who are working the conference organized by Susan Watros. And I finally want to acknowledge the conference organizing committee, which consists of Miriam Greenberg, John Weber, Daniel Guevara, and me. All right, to proceed. So we're here. So we're here to celebrate both the life and the work of Chick Kallenbach. And somebody else will probably mention this later tonight, but Ecotopia was turned down by something like 20 publishers before it finally saw the light of day. It is said that there are something like 1 million copies in print in a number of languages, plus the 1,500 that my students have read. And so they're somewhere out there, and we can't dismiss the book as simply a product of the 1970s and irrelevant today. Although Ecotopia has become a term of derision that we sometimes read in the New York Times, whatever its flaws, it remains an inspiration to many. It even has an entry in the Oxford English Dictionary online, where both the book and the concept are referenced and attributed to Chick. But how widespread is the notion of Ecotopia? I decided to look where all research begins today, on the web. I Googled both Ernest Kallenbach and Ecotopia, and here are the results. 68,000 hits for Ernest Kallenbach, 357,000 hits for Ecotopia. Suggests the term has outrun its creator. But then I wanted to see how Ecotopia has been used and to what end. And that's a little bit more difficult, as you can imagine. You're not going to go and read all 300,000 hits to see who's using the term and how. Instead, I Googled images linked to Ecotopia. You don't find out what number is associated with that when you do it, so I don't actually know how many images turned up. Some were book covers, of course. Others were pictures of Chick. A number portrayed what Ecotopia might look like. Lots of futuristic buildings shrouded in greenery, things like that. I ignored those. This is what I found. First of all, I found political analyses. Ecotopia sometimes appears in tables like these, portraying the peaceful and some might say idealistic worldview. I leave it to you to decide which box we're in at the present moment. There are, of course, other books and magazines. It's given rise to studies like environmental anthropology, Engaging Ecotopia, The Pursuit of Ecotopia, and various other kinds of publications. It's appeared as a record and as a calendar. It shows up in urban design and art exhibitions. Dance and media. Here we have a dance company, a film, a Turkish film, I might point out, and a radio show. And of course, video games. Play the game, save the planet. You know, isn't that what we're doing now, playing games with it? And there are conferences and festivals, not just this one. There are parks and villages. Even Santa Barbara comes in as Ecotopia. That surprised me a little bit, but experienced Ecotopia in Santa Barbara this spring. Well, okay, sure. Turns up on shopping bags, and there are Ecotopia bike tours. And then, of course, there's capitalism. And there's more capitalism. And even more capitalism. It doesn't end. So I was particularly encouraged, however, to see this one, pumpkins. I like that one the best. I think actually Robert Crumb really captured the sentiment with this particular cartoon. This is one of the three outcomes of his Evolution of the City cartoon, which you may have seen. The other two images, interestingly enough, are a high-tech utopia and a ravaged post-nuclear landscape, sort of an autotopia on the one hand and a ruin on the other. Which leads me to the introduction of our keynote speaker, Kim Stanley Robinson, who is somewhere out there. I see him out there. And it turns out he's only 3 months older than I am. Stan currently lives in Davis, but he's really a child of Orange County, which was the inspiration for his Orange County or California trilogy, about which I'll say a couple of things more in a moment. He received a BA in literature from UC San Diego in 1974, completed his PhD in 1982 with Frederick Jameson as his advisor. His thesis was revised and published in 1984 as The Novels of Philip K. Dick. According to an article in The New Yorker, Robinson is generally acknowledged as one of the greatest living science fiction writers, and his work has been labeled by The Atlantic as the gold standard of realistic and highly literary science fiction writing. He's published 19 novels and numerous short stories, and I think is probably best known for his Mars trilogy. Many of his novels and stories have ecological, cultural, and political themes running through them. He's won numerous awards, including the Hugo Award for Best Novel, the Nebula Award for Best Novel, and the World Fantasy Award. Pacific Edge, for those of you who don't know it, is the Ecotopia novel in his Orange County trilogy. And that is the reason he is our keynote speaker tonight. So let me ask Stan to come up to the stage, and let's give him a round of applause.
Well, thank you, Ronnie, for that kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be celebrating Chick Kallenbach and Ecotopia here tonight. So, Kallenbach's Ecotopia was the fiction that expressed the utopian hopes and dreams of the 1970s. And that moment was the moment when the 60s hippie youth grew up. They were having kids, they were settling down, and they were hoping to invent a way of life that expressed their 60s ideals. They didn't want to just shift back into the mode that they had grown up in, but they needed to have a new plan. So 70s utopian thinking was a continuation of the 60s revolutionary spirit. Now, the 60s revolutions were partial, they were compromised, but they did change the world, and they were the end of colonialism worldwide. So they started right after World War II and continued right through the 60s. And in this multi-decade period, all the natives of the world turned into people, as Jean-Paul Sartre once put it. And in the United States, it was the civil rights movement that was the part of this global movement that meant the most, and also resistance to the Vietnam War, because the Vietnam War itself was an anti-colonial war, and so resisting it in the United States was helping in the anti-colonial effort. It was a chaotic time, and one part of it that is really very hard to recover now in terms of how it felt was the feeling that anything could happen. That's not a feeling that we have now, but back then further revolutions seemed entirely possible, and nobody had any idea what was going to come next. So the utopian nonfiction in the 1970s was about 60s Western youth growing up and designing adult lives. And so the design features included topics that were very popular in the nonfiction of the 70s. There was home design like the integral urban house, urban design like Alexander's A Pattern Language or the Paolo Soleri Arcology or Findhorn. There was personal economics like Small is Beautiful, Economics as If People Mattered by Schumacher, or Muddling Towards Frugality, or Progress as If Survival Mattered. There were books on energy like Soft Energy Paths by Amory Lovins. There were philosophy and religion books, and here quite a lot of them, including The Tao of Physics by Capra, or a lot of Zen literature, The Crack and the Cosmic Egg, Castaneda's Don Juan books, also Ram Dass's beautiful Be Here Now, and books by Gregory Bateson and John Lilly. Really, philosophy and religion was big in that decade. Then straight futurism in books like Future Shock by Toffler or Person Planet by Rozak, or ecology like The Greening of America, or feminism like The Dialectic of Sex by Shulamit Firestone. And the Whole Earth catalog covered all these issues in articles. There were some small that were really not bestseller strands of alternative economics, like by people like Herman Daly or Hazel Henderson or Joan Robinson, but this was sort of a missing strand. We'll come back to that later. Now, Ecotopia gathered and drew together all these, but it was the only one that was fiction aside from Le Guin's The Dispossessed, but at that point, The Dispossessed existed in the kind of ghetto world of science fiction and was a little bit of a closed phenomenon compared to Ecotopia, which was a mass market and broad cultural bestseller. So for a long time, it was Kallenbach's books that gave this whole movement a narrative and a fictional shape, a story that could be told. And even if the story was a very old rudimentary standby of utopian literature in which a reporter visits Utopia, gets shown things, has some adventures, and goes native, it's really the classic story there. It goes back to Thomas More, but it does the job, and people are used to it. So Ecotopia became a bestseller, and now it's the book out of that era that's still in print. It's the book that we're celebrating. And I think it's because we love stories, and we can still feel the hopes and the plans of that 1970s utopian moment. Now, none of these books, and nobody alive then, Ecotopia included, had the slightest premonition that the Reagan-Thatcher counter-revolution was coming. And also there was a missing strand of thought in that 70s utopian thinking, which was simply, you could call it macroeconomics, or you could call it better, political economy. These were Cold War era books, and so socialism as a word and concept was off the table in American thinking. So this entire body of literature never advocated fighting capitalism, and they didn't try to imagine post-capitalism. They were about personal adjustments within capitalism, using technical innovations or design or lifestyle or consumer choices or spiritual choices to make a counterculture within a dominant culture that they weren't really challenging. Now, capitalism's reaction to the 60s Cultural Revolution successes in essence was to say this: look, you can do what you like in your messy and disorderly personal lives. Do what you want, as long as you accept that you're going to be paid wages and you're not going to have as much job security as before, and you need to continue to consume at a high rate. So cultural and identity politics, the progress there didn't effectively challenge the global economic system, and in the 1980s, Reagan-Thatcher began the creation and enforcement of neoliberal capitalism. Essentially, the colonial system that had been enforced by armies now began to be enforced by trade laws and by practices. So the aspects of this were free market, the Washington Consensus and austerity abroad, globalized free trade, the privatization of the public sphere, and all of these were establishing what we now call neoliberal market capitalism, which after 1989's fall of the Soviet Union became truly global, and there's no place in the world that doesn't live in this system. So since then, we've lived in that global neoliberal state capitalism, and personal lifestyle choices are broader now than before, which is a remaining success of the 60s cultural revolutions, and they are important. But economic inequality is as great now as it was during the Gilded Age. And you can look at the Gini figures, which is a way of rating economic inequity in a society, where the social democracies of Scandinavia rate in the 20s, and then the United States is up near the banana republics in the 40s and the 50s. And then the world as a whole is actually up in the 60s because there's that much of a discrepancy on the world scale. So private privilege has decisively beaten the public good for the last 35 years as a matter of policy that everybody, or a majority, and certainly the governments have agreed to enact. And this means that we're living by a bad algorithm, where the main rule is to increase quarterly profit and shareholder value, and this means cutting costs as much as possible as a way to increase profits. And the easiest costs that one can cut are first labor costs, in other words, paying people for their work and their lives, and then exteriorizing environmental costs, which means dumping wastes, including CO2, and damaging the biosphere and strip mining the natural world for its short-term gain. So the market, the free market, systemically underprices, especially labor and the environment, and so both of these suffer. And at the same time, the economy relies on people consuming. 70% of the American economy is simply consumption of non-necessities. So debt results. And it's encouraged because banks can use consumer debt to leverage further investment and speculation. And the banks only have to have 3% of their loans in actual assets on hand. This is a rule that they objected to after the 2008 crash, but it got instituted. 3% of the assets on hand is not very much. So it's a highly leveraged system. So we have less security and we have more debt. And all but the top 5% in our society are one job loss or health blow away from poverty. And even educated youth, which are the only ones with a decent chance of middle-class lives, begin with student debt that will take years to pay off. In essence, you sell off years of your future in order to get the education that hopefully will pay off for you later on. Very possibly, a lot of you students will live your whole life in debt. And meanwhile, many of your parents, the baby boomers, having leveraged their own house equities, when the crash came, they ended up with their houses underwater, as they say, and they can't possibly work long enough to pay that off, to pay off the mortgages on their house and recover their equity. So they too will retire and die in debt. So in this context, the utopian fight goes on because it never really dies. People are always scheming and planning to try to make a better world. And indeed, the starker the situation looks, these are the moments where people's imaginations begin to flail in looking for solutions. So again, there is a lot of utopian nonfiction that's trying to find the way forward. And this time, it very often has to do with economics and with political economy. Understand that economics is always a study of capitalism, and it's descriptive rather than prescriptive. If you were to speculate on different kind of economics, then you get into a world of political economy. And it used to be that there would be departments of political economy in universities, but there aren't now. But it comes back anyway. So the utopian nonfiction of our time is often very angry, and it focuses on understanding the crash of 2008, which is a very important moment. It's a genre that has a lot of books in it. There's Michael Lewis's The Big Short, or David Harvey's The 17 Contradictions of Capitalism, Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything, or David Graeber's Debt, Maurizio Lazzarato's Governing by Debt, and in terms of the environment, there's Bill McKibben and all of the climate change literature that's coming out. Amory Levins is a really great example in this case because he's been stubborn throughout these last 40 years, and essentially Soft Energy Paths, his book in the 1970s, he has updated with the help of his entire Rocky Mountain Institute, a whole crew of young people, and has published a book called Reinventing Fire. And again, he's demonstrating that even using the current laws on the books, we could quickly shift to clean energy and live in a much cleaner technological world. So he continues to push his own solution from the 1970s even till now. Usually the players have changed, but he hasn't. So in the midst of this, we had the Occupy movement in, I think, 2011, and it was a great sign of fear and social unrest and desire for change. It was the precariat speaking out of their precariousness. It was a spasm without a good theory or a plan for going forward. And it was also much smaller than the 1960s protest movements. And so another book in this utopian nonfiction of our time is a very interesting one called Why Civil Resistance Works by Erica Chenoweth. And all these books together try to do what the Occupy movement couldn't do, which is to theorize progress from this moment. But now, because we are no longer in the Cold War, criticizing capitalism directly is back on the table, as from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century. And we even have a presidential candidate polling quite high who labels himself a democratic socialist, which could not have happened in the 1970s. Essentially, the 2008 crash shattered the idea that the free market neoliberal capitalism actually works or makes sense or can even be explained. And that means that nobody can justify it. If you can't explain it, you can't justify it. And so both justice and environmental sustainability are bigger issues for people now than the defense of any given economic system or any given ideology. And so now a free market looks like a kind of religious fundamentalism. And the window of acceptable discourse, which is a very useful term, that at any given time in society at large you can talk about certain ideological points, goes too far to the left and too far to the right, you will not get on the TV. You won't see Noam Chomsky on mainstream TV, and you won't see right-wing survivalists. They're outside the window of acceptable discourse. And now, since 2008, the window of acceptable discourse has shifted way to the left. And it may be also to the right because it's such an extreme time, but in any case, it's certainly shifted left also. And the preeminent example of this is Thomas Piketty, the French writer who published Capitalism in the 21st Century, a big bestseller. There's no 1970s equivalent for this text, which basically demonstrates, it's what I call sky is blue research. It demonstrates that as we've practiced it since 1980, capitalism has increased inequality, and it doesn't price the environment properly. So this is something that we think that we knew, but Piketty went through the data and proved it, demonstrated it quantitatively, and he had some suggestions that I'm going to come to later. So there's many books that are what you could call, again, utopian nonfiction, trying to chart a way forward from this moment. There's much less spirituality, and I must express a little bit of nostalgia for the 70s and for the psychedelic paperbacks that filled my bookshelf and were so much fun to read, that shaped my youth in ways that made it a grand adventure. These days it might be a little bit more grim because the times feel tougher, tighter economically for everybody. But what I'm coming up to is, where's the equivalent of Ecotopia itself? In other words, we have all this utopian nonfiction, but we don't yet have the Ecotopia equivalent. Someone needs to write the utopian novel for our time, and so just hypothetically, for tonight's sake, I am going to volunteer to do this. So, an Ecotopia today, and I feel that Chick Kallenbach would be enjoying this kind of a description. It would have to describe a just and sustainable post-capitalism, and also tell the story of how to get there from here, which is crucial. Because you can always make a great plan, but we know that we're in this world now. So what you also want is not just the plan, but the way to get to the good place. And indeed, Kallenbach himself did that when he wrote the prequel to Ecotopia, which was called Ecotopia Emerging. And it's a needed part of any modern utopia, because we want to know what to do now and not just hear about wonderful hypothetical worlds that we suspect will not come to pass. We want a blueprint, and we also want an action plan. And that's what utopias have to do. So first, it has to be global this time. It can't just be one place on Earth like Northern California and Oregon, like Ecotopia was in the 1970s. And I'll give you one good example of why. There has been a real ecotopia on this planet the whole time since the 1970s. Once basically a part of the United States, called the 51st state, and then there was a revolution and it seceded successfully from the United States. We call it Cuba. Cuba is Ecotopia. It had a revolution. It was afterwards hated and embargoed by the US. Some reporters went there, like Kallenbach's reporter, but it went its own way. And it may have even influenced Kallenbach in the writing of Ecotopia, because by 1973-74, it was clear what was going on there. But when the Soviet Union stopped shipping oil to Cuba and it was forced to become even greener than it was before, for lack of oil, the average adult Cuban citizen lost 10 kilos. And so this is the embargo has shoved it back into an almost pre-industrial time of horses pulling plows out in the fields. And it was not really what you would call a utopian situation, but nevertheless, even now, if you have an XY graph and the vertical is health and well-being, and the horizontal is carbon burn, Cuba comes out far better than most of the countries on this planet. And so it's very interesting as an example. But what it shows, by its isolation and by its relative poverty, is that there's no such thing as a pocket utopia. We live in a global economy, and essentially we're in one world. So the solution for any place on Earth involves every other place on Earth. And this sort of ups the gain on the problem, but we are, in fact, what you might call a global village, but it's not a village. It's simply one world that we all live in, and we have not yet properly comprehended that. So the utopian solution has to be global. That increases the difficulties, but we have to do it. And Ecotopia is not wrong to be partial. It's like all the other utopian writings that came in that era. It starts with Thomas More and King Utopus cuts a big trench, and Utopia is an island. Then there's Aldous Huxley's Island. There's Le Guin's Dispossessed, which is the planet Eurus. There's my Mars books. In essence, all the previous utopias have been modeling exercises. We look at them to learn lessons that we might apply to the world at large. But what would be interesting is to actually model the world change itself. So that's hard because there is no good world government, and we're forced to do it at the level of the nation state and by international treaty. Very, very weak governance to make this gigantic change. And so I think that a utopian novel has got to focus on the United States still. The US and the China are the main drivers right now in the world's economy, and most of the world's capital is still located in the United States of America. And the dollar is still the world's dominant and ruling currency. So change in the United States would tend to change everything everywhere. And so we can focus here on the United States as a lever to change the world, which is nice because we have a little bit of control as Americans over what happens in the States. So, in 2008, the crash was the result of a liquidity crisis and a credit crunch, and the world financial system lost confidence in itself and almost collapsed. Governments bailed out the banks that were in trouble at 100% on the dollar, rather than giving them a haircut, as they say. And so they used taxpayer funds to do it. And in essence, the bank's debts, which had been created by crazy speculation and by a frenzy of greed, in effect, by an entire financial community, they defaulted on those debts, and it was shifted onto taxpayers to pay it for them. And the bailout's been estimated at anywhere from $5 to $15 trillion. And it's a little worrisome that you can't even tell whether it was 5 or 15 trillion. So at that point, the US government nationalized General Motors, but it didn't nationalize the banks. But the idea of nationalization is there because of what we did with GM. And with the banks, in 2008, we took on their debt, but we left them in control of their activities and in control of their profits. And they went right back to doing what they were doing before. There was some very weak legislation passed afterwards, but the bank lobbies managed to keep Congress from passing anything particularly effective. And they're back at it. So there will be another crash, because that's how capitalism works. There are bubbles that are very hard to see when you're in them, because we're such a social primates that we tend to act in groups together, and it's hard to get outside a group phenomenon like that. However, when the next crisis comes, we need to be ready for it, because we could nationalize the banks when we bail them out, like we did GM in 2008. And with finance turned into a public utility district, like any other public utility district, like a credit union, then there could be democratic control of finance that could regulate how finance works and take a majority share of the profits involved and cycle that to the people. This would make governments and people very flush and able to do things for themselves. Social services, education, healthcare. The commons would have returned, because the government is a virtual commons. And whenever there's a commons, there's an enclosure movement, which is privatization. And whenever there's an enclosure, there's suffering, and revolution follows. So if we were to take over, we could call this new state government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And as for this next crash, we don't have to wait for it. There's a UC Santa Cruz plan. It's a result of some work done here at a conference called Rethinking Capitalism, and Professor Robert Meister and a colleague of his, Randy Martin, suggested we can trigger a liquidity crisis for the banks anytime that we want by civil nonviolent resistance in the form of mass defaulting on our debts. You could even do it legally and simply declare that you're bankrupt, whether you are or not. You can declare bankruptcy as a legal move. So what I'm saying here is this would have to be done by everybody or by a huge amount of people. But since all of our debt allows this leveraged bank speculation, the moment that our debt looks bad, the moment people declare student debts and house mortgages to be odious debts and declare sovereignty, there would be too many of us to prosecute. Like Breck said, you can't exactly dismiss the people and elect another one. So the bank system would immediately crash, as in 2008. It would be a crisis of confidence. Mortgage bonds and derivatives based on student debt, which already exist, would all go subprime at once and turn into unredeemable promissory notes. And the big banks and investment firms, meaning only 8 or 9 companies on this entire planet, would not know who to trust, would go to government to demand a bailout, as in 2008, but this time the government would bail them out and take them over, as they did General Motors. Then the banks are credit unions and public utilities, and there are huge returns of finance now owned by the state, and the state would then not be an instrument of finance, but rather an instrument of the people controlling finance. This would be a big shift, basically a revolution. And quantitative easing, where new money is made up from nothing and given to the banks, billions every month, that could actually be given directly to people so that you could be the Institute of Jennifer, or you could be the People's Republic of George, and be getting direct quantitative easing infusions like the citizens of Alaska get free oil money for living where they live. So then, of course, global capital would try to run elsewhere. Stock markets would crash, but when stocks are low, there's always some people that buy them and raise them back up again. And China already has a nationalized banks. They would look at us and say, well, we do this already. What's so strange about it? And they want the United States doing well. We are their main customer, and they also own a lot of us. So then the European Union would be forced to follow, and the G20 would be forced to follow, and then it's game over, because that's most of the economy of the world right now. And there we would be, people in control of their economy. What a concept. So what would people do? If people were in charge of the economy rather than vice versa, how would things run? It would be a newly created global ecotopia. What would happen? Well, first, obviously, full employment. Everybody should have the right to work. And if government could hire you, then private industry would have to compete for employment, and suddenly there would be demand. It's kind of neoclassical economics at that point, and everybody would be able to say, look, I don't need to take your crappy wages, I can work for the government instead. This would be like the WPA during the New Deal. What would we do? Well, it would be environmental work, landscape restoration, habitat creation, clean energy and infrastructure, education, and helping to get the poorest 3 billion out of poverty, making every place good on this planet. All this would avoid the mass extinction event that is on the way, and it would help to deal with the inevitable climate change that's coming. And habitat corridors all around this continent to allow the wild animals to prosper is not only doable by the way that people are contracting into cities anyway, but it's also a Chick Kallenbach idea who was suggesting for the last 40 years that the upper plains and the Rocky Mountains should be returned to a buffalo and wolves ecology, and that people and planet would be doing better from that. So you would also want to have a hard carbon tax, where a rising tax on carbon, and we don't call that a tax anymore, we call that paying the true cost, because that's how much carbon really costs, and that's what we need to pay in order not to be ripping off the next generations. Then also a progressive tax, of course, but not just on incomes, but also on capital assets. This is the Piketty plan, Thomas Piketty, because if you're rich, you can always bury your income in capital returns, capital gains. You can essentially dodge the fact and pay yourself as your own employee a small amount of money and get taxed on that. But if you have a progressive tax, a sharp one, on capital assets, it simply means the horizontalization of wealth. It means the beginning of social democracy big time. And it would put governments in control of accumulated capital that is now owned by an oligarchy that is mostly buying our governments. So we need that progressive tax on capital assets. And then you could say to the members of the oligarchy, because there are some people that will fight for this system and there are some people that are just going to go along with whatever the system exists, but for people who fear loss, you could always guarantee everybody that you get to keep $10 million, and you just have to live with that. In this system, a market would still exist, but it would be marginalized to toys and diversions, tourisms and entertainments. So the basic needs of life, food, water, shelter, clothing, healthcare, education, and work would all be public utilities, something that you have a right to as a citizen of this planet. But then beyond that, capitalism would be the residual, and of course it could still play its games. It could still work on its iPhones. If everybody on the planet lived at adequacy and capitalism was shoved to the margin, that margin would prosper too. It would go crazy because people like to play. And people would be free to throw themselves into realms of culture where the market could be a kind of a sport rather than a desperate, forced survival march. That's where it needs to stay. And of course this would protect the environment, but the environment would have to be protected by regulation and tended and nourished and paid for as such. It would be the work of civilization. And it would also be playful and a matter of gardening, of playing with the other animals on the planets. And also to make cycles that can go on through the centuries in perpetuity rather than being the strip mining and end game that we're now engaged on. So this would be the new Ecotopia for our times. I feel like Chick Kallenbach would like it. And I want to say, what did I say at the end? Oh, spread the word. Thank you.
We do have a few minutes for questions. Do we have those microphones? Okay, are there any, does anyone want to ask?
I see some hands.
Where we should start?
I see some hands. I don't see any microphones.
Yeah, where are they?
If someone wants to shout, I can repeat it for others.
So you mentioned defaulting on loans and stuff, take out the big banks.
Yeah.
What about the smaller banks and credit unions that might be trying to help their communities and stuff? Do you default on loans for those too?
No. And also I would say keep paying your taxes. Regard the government as the people's company and as your space, your team, of the people, by the people, for the people. So you don't do like Wesley Snipes and decide unilaterally and as a single individual not to pay your taxes, or you get thrown in jail. And indeed, defaulting on your debts is a radical move. Maybe you want to have a social media movement where everybody understands that they do it during the next superstorm, or they do it on the next 4th of July or the next May Day. I mean, pick your holiday, everybody coordinate. And what Chenoweth says in Why Civil Resistance Works is you only need about 15% of a population to do a civil resistance action, and it's enough to crash the system and also get a whole lot of other people to join you. So it would need to be coordinated action so that you can't get prosecuted as an individual. And am I recommending that you default on your debts and call them odious debts? I'm a science fiction writer, why not? Oh yeah, we have a mic.
When you mentioned world government and just the word government, I started to worry. It's a big problem. How does the people control the government, even if we get the solution as you've described?
Well, it's a good question, because government is not just, you know, our team or whatever, but actually the commons. It's the source of, it's the battlefield itself, government. And the oligarchy would like to run the government, and just the algorithm of capitalism would like to have the government working for it. So you do have to struggle to keep control of government. One thing I will say, though, is this idea of, for a while there, the movement, the counterculture was fighting globalization per se. I say that's a mistake. We're in a global economy, And it's run by the World Trade Organization, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and really the United States, but also the G20. If the rules for the global system were good rules, environmentally sound and leading towards social justice, then a bad actor, capital itself, would not be able to escape to a flag of convenience and go somewhere else where the rules are slack. So in essence, a global system is good where the rules are good. And of course, if the rules are bad, the global system looks like dystopia. So what we need to do is to exert enough pressure on and pretend that democracy is real until we're proved otherwise. And if democracy is real, you vote in the politicians that will enforce positive changes in the laws that technocrats deal with at the level of the World Trade Organization. So this is complicated and hard. Especially those of you who are students here, it's not going to go away during your lifetime. This battle will last throughout the lifetime of everybody in this room. It will never come to an end. It's a stepwise battle that is not going to be solved in the year 2020. It's going to be a scaffolding from one step to the next. So you have to be in it for the long haul.
Hi, just to follow up on this question about international trade agreements, because right now we're obviously the TPP is a big issue, and part of the way that this is being sold is the idea that it, the United States is the most responsible of the major powers in terms of environmental legislation, and that we need to have the TPP so that we can set the rules. But I think that I've been reading some articles about how a lot of these provisions are basically unenforceable, and it's basically a bunch of greenwashing. And so I wonder if, you seem to be saying that we shouldn't fight globalization as such, but I wonder if having like if international trade as such is inimical to our environmental goals, and how you see international trade working with a kind of ecotopia vision, or whether we need to fight globalization as such.
Well, thank you for that. And those are two or three really complicated questions. This Trans-Pacific trade thing, I hate the way that it's been negotiated in secret. What's that about? And so now Congress has some tiny short period of time to look at it. And of course, Congress itself is a compromised body, and ordinary citizens don't really know what we would be agreeing to as a country. So this is ugly stuff. And it's worth opposing that particular agreement for its process, whatever its content is. When it does come to content, 75% of the capital of the world is still owned by the United States one way or another. It's peculiar because we think of this as being a more international world, but we were so successful after World War II that we are indeed the financial empire that we try to pretend that we're not. As such, I do think that to the extent that we need trade at all, we can get into these things, and we have to change the World Trade Organization. Their rules are non-sustainable, anti-environment, anti-labor rules. So we do have to stay engaged, but I think way more critically, way more leftist approach to trade agreements. And then, of course, the idea of the local, to burn less carbon by just consuming more of what's around you, and also examining your life and realizing, why do I need to consume? All I need to do is sit out here on the campus, sitting face to face with my friends, drinking a cup of tea and looking at the bay. Do I really need the latest ski equipment, snowboard equipment, parachuting equipment, etc.? In other words, say no to the consumerism that drives a lot of this free trade stuff. So these things are all connected and complicated, but I do think we have to regard it as a global system and not pretend that a local or provincial solution would solve the problem, because a pocket utopia will be either a Cuba or a Liechtenstein. Essentially, it has to be global. And that's ugly, but true.
Stan, your analysis is dazzling, but we can't solve the problem by redistributing money, because money isn't a unit of trade. It's really trading in pieces of slave. As David Graeber points out in his coinage, taxation, slavery triangle, we've never abolished slavery, we've just outsourced it, which is why the United States makes nothing but money and the rest of the world makes things that money can buy. So in order to change that, you can't nationalize the banks. You have to localize them. Because right now we have capital that floats free in the atmosphere globally, and it can be bought with money. Things can be traded that are really the wealth of communities. If we took that carbon out, or took the capital like carbon out of the air and put it in the soil of local communities, we could then route the credit to it, and we could extend the credit that buys the houses. Right now the banks buy the houses for money they create out of thin air. As long as they own the houses, they own all of us. So by taking back the capital, we can then extend the credit, and we can be the banks and take back our houses and our lives.
Thank you. I agree with that. And I would say that you nationalize the banks in order to get a harness on international finance, and so that we don't have this phantom fictional capital world out there that hovers over and vampires on real economies and real manufacturing. So it's only one part of the plan, and the local banks is a fantastic idea. And in fact, again, at UC Santa Cruz, Professor Daniel Friedman, working on these very issues and available to talk to, wonderful guy I spent an hour with him this afternoon, and he's working on just what you were talking about, essentially the free associations of people crowdsourcing money to be lent when needed, and it's an alternative to banking proper, as are small local credit unions. So yes, I think that there's many parts to the plan, and that the front is broad, and we don't really, in many cases, we don't have to choose either or, but have to actually fight the battle at global, national, and local levels all at once. Thank you.